Last we left Ruagine, he had recruited the Bastokan legend Zezag into the ranks of the Serpent Generals. With his previous additions of Flame Serpent General Gadalar and Gale Serpent General Najalith, their band now numbered 4. He had his mind set on a 5th member with a skill set to perfectly round out the fellowship, and the circumstances under which he did so are remarkable. It is a tale which would shake the foundations of the Empire of Artagan and bring one girl to the precipice of shaping the course of history. Like Zezag before her, Melia Lipo was a complete mystery to the people of Alzabi when she arrived in the capital, for Mithra remain a racial minority in the Empire, typically inhabiting its furthest reaches. Because of the reserved and somber demeanour she fronts, Melia Lipo is a real enigma. It's safe to assume that only a handful of people in the entirety of Vana'diel know of her past. And when our tale is finished, you will know exactly why it is such a closely guarded secret. Melia's tale begins in her homeland, a place unexplored by adventurers, but fortunately, with the Mithran people being intrepid by nature, first-hand accounts are aplenty of the mysterious land of Olzaira. Olzaira is the homeland of the Mithra, and is located south of the Elshamo Island, and even further south of the larger Quan continent. Olzaira consists of 2 large islands connected by an archipelago. The land is governed by the Garnabol matriarchate, meaning that Mithran society is female-dominated, with the central chieftainess, the matriarch, ruling with the blessing and cooperation of the numerous tribes dotted across the islands. The matriarch has final authority on matters of national consequence, such as when she authorized the dispatchment of Mithran mercenaries to fight in the Crystal War. Given its relative proximity to the Elshamo Island, some of these Mithran tribes have emigrated to the secluded island over the years, and some went further to the Federation of Windurst when the Crystal War concluded, and the sizable Mithran population settled in the nation they were instrumental in saving. But it is still the former of these two which gives us the best glimpse into the nature of Olzaira. The port town of Kazan most likely resembles what a settlement of its like would resemble if found further south. A tropical commune surrounded by a natural barrier of a dense jungle. This would hold true for settlements situated on Olzaira's 2 larger islands, but the peripheral islands lack such a natural defense. This is where the island of Saya, the northeasternmost island of Olzaira, home of Meli and the Empire of Artagan, enter our tale. The exact circumstances behind Artagan's conquest and annexation of Saya from Olzaira are unknown, but it stands to reason that Artagan, with its extensive history of conflicts with maritime nations such as Aframad, ended up in conflict with Olzaira due to disputes over territorial waters. Following Artagan's victory, the island of Saya became a vassal state of the Empire, but rather than rule directly, a system of indirect liberal rule was established, a system which let the Mithra largely be as they had been before. There was no ulterior motive from the incumbent emperor, he was just being magnanimous in victory. Keen to avoid further conflict with Olzaira, the empire instead set up a cultural exchange program between the 2 nations, and this is how Melia Lipo first came to Alzabi. Meli's journey to the imperial capital was made possible through the patronage of her village and of the Walhara temple, who invited her to study philosophy as part of the ongoing exchange program. Although a diligent student, Meli was also very reclusive, shunning the company of her fellows and spending the time between her studies to herself, fishing at the port long into the evening. Her introversion was not without surprise though. Mithra were a rarity in Alzabi, and she had not received the warmest of welcomes from the other students, who ridiculed her distinct accent and whispered ill of her behind her back. She was aware of this but opted not to escalate matters further. Zezag navigated these issues when he arrived from Bastok on account of his headstrong and boisterous mannerisms, but Meli was cut from a different cloth, not to mention a lot younger. Her tutor, Elder Nadi, tried to get her to come out of her shell repeatedly but to no avail. One day he tried a new approach. Meli was not alone in her exclusion from the student body, for another student of the temple, a young woman named Afmau, was struggling in her studies and was likewise finding it exceptionally difficult to connect with anyone. Nadi saw an opportunity for both of his students, with one being an academic prodigy and the other one lost at sea, but both in mutual need of companionship. He encouraged Meli to reach out to Afmau, and Meli, keen to end the conversation and hopefully prove her point, obliged him. Afmau was unmistakably nervous, stammering and missing cues, not allowing Meli to get a word in. Afmau suggested the two go get some afternoon tea as she was interested about Saya, an evidently sore subject for Meli. Melia and Athma would eventually become closer after this rough first encounter, the former never becoming aware of who the latter really was, as it remained a closely guarded secret to the wider populace. Although he had his mission of filling the ranks of the Serpent General still pressing, Ruajin's attention had been pulled in the direction of a series of murders which had left the officers of the Imperial Army stumped. Over the course of the past few months, 11 dead bodies had shown up across Al-Zarbi, and with no evident connection between them, the authorities feared a serial killer was in their midst. Ruajin enlisted the aid of a friend from his former unit turned private detective, Yunhim, and soon enough they found themselves at the scene of another victim. The victim was the former Governor General of Overseas Imperial Holdings. The attacker had cut his kidney out from behind with a single circular strike. This was not the work of a common thief, as the victim's valuables had not been taken. As the two contemplated the crime scene, they were joined by Ralban, captain of the Immortals. The Immortals' relationship with the Imperial Army was always tenuous, but this case definitely fell under their jurisdiction, so Ralban divulged what they had discovered. He revealed that the Immortals had been conducting their own discreet investigation on this matter for several months. The former Governor General was suspected of receiving bribes from provincial governors, likely why he had been the former Governor General when he met his demise. Ralban noted that the methods used to kill other victims had been extremely violent and varied, likely to prevent a profile being assembled on the perpetrator. However, despite these efforts, the Immortals had identified connecting threads between all the murders. Every victim had been found with a Panama peel forced into their mouths, and all had been high-ranking Imperial officials involved in some degree of political corruption. The Immortals discerned that this was not the work of a psychopath murdering people at random. This was the work of an extremely skilled assassin with motives of revenge. Content that the Immortals could handle the case, Ruajin handed over jurisdiction to Ralban. Still, something did not sit right with Ruajin. His mind cast back to the day he became Sky Serpent General, and he recalled that Mishad had been made a Governor General and posted out of Al-Zarbi. Ruajin pondered. If men of Mishad's disposition found themselves in positions of power over Imperial subjects, without the direct oversight of the proper authorities, then had something happened in the provinces that had been suppressed, and the news of which had not reached the capital. He could not let this case go. Less than a day later, Ruajin was alerted by Yunhim that yet another body had been discovered. This time it was the former Grand Vizier. There had been some creative and brutal assassinations prior, but this one was truly unbelievable. The victim had been decapitated with a single clean strike. Yet he had been in a busy part of the Al-Zarbi market when the attack occurred, and nobody had seen the assassin. Najelith, with her years of military service in foreign lands, discerned the murder weapon, a chakram. Ralban said that this specific method and choice of weapon had given the Immortals a clear profile on who they were searching for. Only an insurgent from the Saya freedom fighters could have had the skill with the chakram. This covert Special Forces unit was an offshoot of the Saya Defense Force. Although Saya was Imperial territory, it still had its autonomy as per Artagan's preferred system of indirect rule, and it was permitted to field an independent defense force. Despite their best efforts in crushing the insurgency, it was now evident that some of the members had survived, but Ruajin was still at a loss as to why these attacks were happening here in the capital rather than in Saya. Ralban thought he had discerned the motive. The former Grand Vizier, now decapitated on the street, had once been the Governor General of the southern provinces. While in office, he had enacted a land law in Saya, which led to farming land being seized by corrupt officials. When the new plantations failed, mass death from starvation occurred, but events were covered up until the Immortals intervened. The assassin remained at large, and the next target could only be of an even higher profile. Ruajin then remembered. The Empress was to present a student of the Walhara Temple with a scholarship award the very next day. Ralban gave his assurances that the Immortals had an impenetrable security net, but Ruajin had just been struck by an epiphany. Being close with the Empress and being one of the precious few she ever confided in, Ruajin knew who their assassin was, but he held his tongue in present company. This would require a very specific approach to resolve without further loss of life. The young woman who had come to Al-Zarbi to study philosophy was not Melia Lipo. Melia Lipo had never existed. She was a fabricated identity grafted onto a severely traumatized and damaged young woman. Melia's family had been among those who had been ousted by the former Grand Vizier. Her mother had died in the ensuing famine, leaving her to fend for herself at the age of 13, eventually joining the Saiyan Defense Force by lying about her age. When she was discovered, she was forced to join the freedom fighters and was reported as deceased to the Governor General. The unit set about putting her vitriolic hatred to use and trained her in espionage, sabotage and assassination. She now met with undercover members of her unit in Nashmal. The only thing that kept Melia going was retribution, the very thing which tied her to the false name she now went by, but she could not help but despair at the apparent futility of what they were doing. No matter how many corrupt officials and politicians she assassinated, more scurried in to take their place. They concluded that Otagon needed a dramatic show of force to change their ways, and they had a plan in motion to do exactly that. Melia was to assassinate Empress Nashmira. They had discovered that due to her excellent grades, Melia had been chosen to represent the student body before the Imperial Court the next day, giving her the perfect opportunity to assassinate the Empress. Not since the days of Emperor Balron, when an Eastern ninja had trained the famous katana Nagi on his heart, had an assassin had such a chance. Despite all she had done up until now, this prospect caused Melia alarm. Although she may well succeed, she asked how she was meant to escape. The reply was brutally honest. There was no way Melia would escape, let alone survive. The Immortals would kill her before she even got out of the hall. Sensing her unease, the unit asked her if her student life had made her forget her memories, how the girl who was now Melia Lipo had been forced out of her home and watched as her mother starved to death to save her. Melia rallied, resolved to see her vengeance through to the end. She left for Alzabi to begin her preparations. The next day, Melia stood in the throne room during the ceremony, doing her utmost to remain inconspicuous whilst looking for an opening. Concealed behind a curtain, as was tradition, the Empress gave her address to the students gathered. Melia spotted 4 Immortals, Raban among them. She knew she only had one opportunity and her timing had to be perfect. With most eyes on the curtain, Melia waited until she was certain Raban's focus was directed elsewhere before making her move. Moving into position, concealed from view, Melia glanced at the base of the curtain and immediately realized that something was wrong. The voice which had spoken was definitely that of the Empress, but the feet she saw belonged to an automaton. They knew she was coming. The automaton was playing a recording of the Empress's voice. Elder Nadi prompted Melia to give the student address, and as the people began to notice she was no longer there, Melia knew she was compromised. Throwing a tear gas bomb into the crowd, Melia made her escape in the ensuing pandemonium. She had suspicion where the Empress had been moved to, but it was all she had to go on. Rishvi immediately checked behind the curtain and sure enough found one of the Empress's automatons in her stead. Incandescent with rage, Raoban gave chase. Ruajin had met with the Empress before the ceremony and, along with the Serpent Generals, had moved her to the safety of the Walhara Temple. Empress Nashmira had confided in the Serpent Generals that she knew who the assassin was, one of her precious few friends, Melia Lipo. Nashmira pleaded with them not to kill her but to take her into custody. The generals heard the commotion making its way from the palace and they knew Melia had arrived. Coming face to face with Melia, Zazar called for his comrades to stand down. He could finish this without the need to escalate it any further. Najelef knocked an arrow in case she was needed, but they both noticed Gadalar, who had completely ignored Zazarg and had almost finished casting one of his signature explosive spells. Najelef thought on the spot, firing her blunted arrow at Gadalar, silencing him and stopping the spell before he destroyed the temple and brought its rubble down on Nashmira inside. Before Melia could act on the bizarre scene, Ruajin charged outside and drew the Algol. He yelled at Melia to give herself up, but his plea fell on a mind made up. She charged at Ruajin with daggers drawn. He swung to meet the onrushing Melia, but she vanished into thin air. Looking around in bewilderment, he spotted her too late. She landed on the flat of the Algol. Stunned by the sheer audacity of Melia's technique, Ruajin failed to react in time. Melia ran the length of the Algol and, using Ruajin's own face as a launch pad, leapt onto the wall of the temple and ascended it with staggering speed. Hearing a loud whistle mocking them, the 4 generals looked to the roof of the temple and saw Melia gloating. She knew the temple well, having spent ample time there, and knew of a passage to get into the chamber the Empress was housed in. The The generals had left their charge completely unprotected. They rushed back into the temple to see Melia with her dagger to Nashmira's throat, a manic look in her eyes. Desperate to buy precious seconds, Ruajin tried to talk Melia down. Melia found herself in a position she had never been in. Her previous targets had been just that, targets she hated for reasons she felt justified. But now she found herself with the power of life and death over someone she felt a sincere connection with. Her composure and dedication to her cause breaking, Melia could not bring herself to kill Aphmau, and she dropped her weapon. Then she heard a dreaded sound a second too late. The Immortals had arrived. Amnath's spell sent her flying, slamming into a wall and knocking her unconscious. Ralban, still understandably angry, berated the incompetence of the Serpent generals. Ruajin could not protest, lamenting their deplorable performance when they were needed most. Ralban was furious that the Immortals had not been informed that the Empress had been moved out of the palace, and again asserted his control over the matter at hand. Sentencing Melia to death by fire for the crime of high treason, Amnath began to cast, but was stopped by Nashmira. Nashmira, getting to her feet but still visibly shaken, explained that Melia was the only one among the students who had ever been kind to her. This is what had caused the other students to turn on Melia in the first place, but despite the stigma she had garnered as Aphmau, Melia did not abandon her. Beneath the layers of trauma both harboured, Melia and Aphmau at their cores were kindred spirits. Both were forced into lives they did not want at young ages. Both were forced to wear false identities, and both did not feel at home in their own homelands. Melia was an assassin, that much was evident, but the fact remained that they had all failed in their duties to protect the Empress. It was only by Melia's conscience that she had not died a few moments ago. The penalty for failing to protect an incumbent monarch was likewise death, and not wanting to have to execute everyone present, Nashmira took control of the situation out of the hands of both parties. She took Melia into her protection despite the protests of Ralban, who likely felt very hard done by. Melia was staring as Nashmira crouched beside her. She was at a loss as to why she was being spared. Her vengeance had burnt out and no clear path lay before her. After this incident, Melia resided within the palace under Nashmira's protection, unable to return to her student life. Nashmira's final ruling on the case was that Melia had actually been doing the imperial court a service by assassinating corrupt officials and politicians connected to the Saiyan famine. It was then, by no small measure of irony, that the skill set Melia had developed was put to better use in service of Atagan and its people. She was placed under the watchful eye of Ruajin and assigned command of Atagan's counter-espionage unit. Melia was responsible for the capture of scores of Mikado ninjas, and was especially effective in thwarting the Lamia and their undead swarms, a task which combined her assassin training with the spiritual training in white magic she had received as a student. After a year of service to the Empire she once swore to defeat, Melia was summoned to the Imperial Palace where Nashmira and the 4 Serpent generals awaited her. Ruajin informed her that in recognition of her service to Atagan and its people, referring specifically to her recent success in preventing the Mamulja savages sinking the Imperial Navy, she was to be promoted to the position of Spring Serpent General. Zazag, Najalith and Gadalar all sounded their approval at the decision. They had come a long way since they faced each other outside the temple a year prior. The ice had taken considerable time to break, but in due course it had. Empress Nashmira only had one request of her friend. The daggers she had used for so long did not suit a student of philosophy. She asked that Melia instead wield a club and shield befitting that of a white mage. Melia was taken aback at the prospect of learning an entirely new form of combat after having used her original style for so long, but Nashmira's words drew her attention to the materials used to make the armaments Ruajin had placed before her. They were made of Saiyan rosewood and ebony wood. Through this gesture, earned through perseverance and redemption, Melia had been made the true hope of her people, placing her where she had hoped to be all those years ago when she had set off down a darker path. Melia's memory of Saya had turned her into a zealot using force to heal an open wound, but with this recognition of her suffering, healing could begin in earnest. She had truly become an icon of her people, a vengeful assassin turned white mage and Spring Serpent General, letting soothing waters wash over a painful past. Sensing the rising emotions creeping onto her expression, Ruajin smiled and whispered to Melia that he had not forgotten that she had leapt onto the flat of the Algol. He was likely never going to forget that. As the two bantered back and forth about when their rematch would come, the other generals could not help but laugh. they were an odd bunch of fellows that call themselves the Serpent Generals. Melia's story is one of a person overcoming trauma, hatred and vengeance to rise above their former self and become someone greater. Misfortune and injustice can lead one down the dark path of extremism, a path fueled by vitriol. Vitriol burns bright, but it also burns out fast. All it can take is a simple act of kindness and understanding to mend a shattered life. Her story is a reminder that no matter how far you fall, life will always welcome you home. This brings us to the end of the Saga of the Serpents. The Serpent Generals were refounded not only to save lives besieged by danger in a time of conflict, but also to inspire the people weary of hardship and to spur them onward evermore. When he was tasked with finding those worthy to meet these goals, Ruajin could have never expected those he would find camaraderie with. They would come from all corners of Artagan's expansive empire, from across the oceans and from lands far and foreign. They all came as individuals worn down by past sins, legacies, tragedy, expectation and despair, but they all rose through adversity to find new meaning, raising others as they did. Together they became that which they could have never imagined to become alone, a true fellowship from different walks of life but all united in a common purpose, the pursuit and protection of those who would bring in a brighter future. The path to this brighter future would be an arduous one, but they would not have to traverse it alone anymore. They would together, lighting the way for people to follow. In this future they may well no longer be needed, when innocent lives could flourish in times of peace and prosperity, but even if that day were to come, they could all be assured that the tales of their deeds would live on in the hearts and minds of the people they inspired.